much more diverse place to live.
Jim Reid, well, interesting though all this is, does it actually matter? Well, Daniel Knowles is the Britain correspondent of The Economist and has been picking through the numbers all day. A.C. Grayling is Master of New College of the Humanities. Douglas Murray is a neoconservative writer. And Bonnie Greer is a broadcaster and playwright, one of those counted as being born abroad, and also Deputy Chair of the British Museum. First, Douglas, when you walk the streets of London, do you think it actually matters that those who identify as white British are now in a minority?
Well, I think it'll matter to a lot of them, and I think it'll matter that in the last 10 years, with 3 million more foreign-born people in the UK, that they'll have noticed that government after government has not done what it said it would do. We have had 10 years of politicians of all main parties saying that they wanted to limit mass immigration, and we have seen that they have not, and now it's official.
Do you think, when you walk the streets of London, I mean, do you actually notice day by day? Because this is a snapshot of a year ago and 10 years ago. Do you think day by day people notice that white Britons are in a minority?
Well, I actually think in London London is actually the least interesting in a way. Well, London is very interesting, but London's had the least change in terms of the minority growth in a sense. I think where it's interesting is actually outside of London. It's on the outskirts of London. If you look at inner London was sort of about 35%. Non-white and foreign-born in 2001. It's now only about 42%. It's risen, but there are other bits of the country where it's doubled or even tripled from much smaller levels. But
can you, if that's the case, and it's in different places all over the country, does it matter in the sense that it makes us a more intolerant country because people resent it, or does it make it as a more tolerant country because we mix with different people?
I think we've become a more tolerant country. I think 10 years ago we had the problem that minority groups in this country were very much concentrated heavily in London, heavily concentrated and a few other industrial cities and other places, but they're now much more spread out, and it's so there are far fewer sort of white British people who have who don't have any experience at all of people from a different background now than did, and you can see that in the huge rise in the number of people from a mixed ethnicity background. There's now 1 million or so.
Indeed, it's now 1.2 million, up from it's doubled actually in those 10 years. I mean, what's your take on this? Do you think it actually matters? Do you think people day by day notice it? They notice it now because we're talking about the census.
Well, I live in the West End, not far from this studio, and of course I can see exactly what this demographic is talking about. People are living their lives. I don't think it matters to anyone at all. It's interesting to have it been brought up. But if you're talking about where I live, which is around Oxford Street, no. I mean, that's the way it looks. And London's a port, and it's always been an entry for people.
But if as Daniel was suggesting, this is now spreading out during the rest of the country, is that the rest of the country can look forward to that kind of future, for good or ill?
Well, I wonder if people look, in the sense, think about their future in the day-to-day. This is the reality of life. This is what it is, and I think that's how people are living.
What do you make of that change for the culture of the country as a whole? I mean, do you think there's a downside to it, or do you think it's all positive in the sense that we may become more tolerant, if Daniel's right?
Well, I think on the whole it's a very positive thing, a thing to be celebrated. I mean, what we've got now is even greater consciousness of the diversity of the world of which we are an important part. I mean, this is globalization coming to roost at home in a way, and a very good thing it is too. And I think what's rather striking about it is that because London has always been a great centre for all sorts of people, all sorts of foods, all sorts of cultural traditions, music, the arts, that has made it possible for people elsewhere in the country to think much more positively about the possibilities for themselves, having the role of being a host community for immigrants.
Well, the role of being a host community of immigrants, is there, apart from the resentment which you put your finger on, that some people don't like it, is there actually a downside? Is there something you can point to and say, this has made our lives worse?
Well, I think there's a downside. Two things I'd cite. The first thing is that there's a downside for many people in this country who don't live in the West End of London, minutes from this studio, and who don't share A.C. Grayling's views either, who feel that they simply look at their country, they've looked at it change immensely.
But that's the resentment question. I'm asking you if there's anything you can put your finger to beyond the fact that some people resent it. Well, some people resent lots of things, but is there something you can put your finger on and say it's changed for the worse?
I was going to say, one thing that's changed for the worse is that people in this country have a better reason reason not to believe politicians of any main party after this decade, which is the first point I wanted to make, which is certainly a point about resentment. I think the second thing, which is it's also important to remember, is that you know, I live in London as well. London is we're used to what the census today has shown us, and by and large we tend to be sort of happy with it. But it's not about whether I or any of you feel happy about this, but among other things, what it's done to our country. And one thing which I think really needs to be focused on is the fact that we need to look at one of the downsides of this, which is that in a period of unemployment, in a period of recession, foreign-born workers coming into Britain and taking jobs. Now, of course, in many cases, they're either high-skilled people or people willing to perform jobs which people here are not willing to perform. Exactly. So these are people doing very important work. Exactly. But what happens when you import a working class? The working class becomes an underclass.
Okay.
But the problem is that for policymakers and politicians, and I'm calling it the Obama effect, people, they're not aware of the big change that's going on. They're not making policy that's reflecting the change in this country. And this is all of the parties. They don't, and broadcasting as well, they don't reflect the way the country is. And that affects the people, as you were saying, those people not able to see the reality of the way the country is changing. It cannot be stopped. So the question is, how is it going to be managed, and what kind of spirit is it going to be managed? And that's the problem.
Also, you've been crunching the numbers today. The question of part-time working, and that has changed. That pattern has changed, and also the question of housing, the fact that many more of us now rent, does suggest a period of flux, that the past 10 years have been a real sense of flux for many people, particularly in their 20s and 30s.
Well, especially the last 5 years. And you can see it, you know, we've reached a point now where nobody can really buy a house in London, certainly, unless they have help, and the average age of unassisted first-time buyer is going up and up. And you have London boroughs where, you know, the average house price is 10 times the average salary. And so, yeah, that's kind of inevitable. And I think that does go part with the part-time. I think some of the part-time rise is probably due to more women going to work, which is probably a good thing. But some of it is, certainly the last few years, is insecurity.
Well, does that insecurity create a more or less rooted society? In other words, we don't feel the sense of aspiration that people always felt, that you can buy a house, this is something you can do, and that may have gone, and you may not get a full-time job either.
I think property prices really do constitute a serious problem for just that reason. Putting what is for our last generation a major asset right out of the reach of people who are struggling anyway. It's a surprising thing to have happened in a way, and needs a kind of major readjustment, especially in London. And this has to be addressed, I suppose, in part. People are trying to address it by building more affordable housing in the inner city areas and brownfield sites and the like. But that is not happening enough.
But does that change, if that changes your kind of aspiration, though, doesn't it? In other words, it was always something that people had in their minds. You work hard in this country, you probably can own your own home. That's a good thing. That's changed.
But it is an Anglo-Saxon notion. It's very much about how Americans and the British see wealth, stability. In France and other places, there's not that much emphasis on bricks and mortar.
Well, Germany, many more people rent, and it's considered normal.
So this shift has a lot to do with the people who are coming in as well, and also with the basis. We don't build in this country. I mean, I don't have any opinion on it, one or the other, but we don't build.
But is that the end of the Margaret Thatcher's dream of the property-owning democracy, where everybody can aspire to that? I mean, do you think people of your generation actually do aspire to it, or don't care?
Well, everyone wants to own their own house. It's just nobody can afford to in my generation without having rich parents, which most of us don't have. I mean, this is a baby boomer thing. I don't know if you two of you probably do count as baby boomers, but the baby boomers had a great advantage, had a great luck with property, and it made the generation rich. But my generation has suffered for that, and unless you can tap into your parents on that, there's no way you can afford a property.
Well, partly the boomers have outlived the security net. I mean, the security net was only meant for people to be 65, 70.
Exactly.
Well, we're going to be a lot longer than that. But I think on a profound level, we are in a post-Christian society right now. It's going to take a long time for that to come home to people, but we are. And some of that has to do with the newcomers, but also it's going to change our own perceptions of the idea of homeowning, and all of these other
I wondered about
strictures that we've had.
This post-Christian society, again, look at the numbers. I mean, there's still a lot of people who identify as Christians, although
There are
many
still lots
more
of
do
people
say
who
they're
identify as
atheists.
Christians,
And many of the new immigrants identify as Christians,
exactly.
Poles and people from Africa.
The few places that have sort of seen an increase in the number of Christians are Boston, which has had an awful lot of Poles move in, Lambeth, which has had a lot of Catholic, black African Christians move in. But and I kind of think that just asking how you identify as Christian, it doesn't really show who's really Christian. I mean, there's an awful lot of people who went to a Church of England school and might have ticked Christian 10 years ago and now don't. So.
But why do you think that has changed, though? Even that would be significant, wouldn't it? That
yes,
people who self-identify as Christian but never went to church don't do that, or quite a number don't.
Well, it's certainly true, and I'm not entirely sure why, but it does seem like it's slightly less important
does that matter, though?
Well, if this is a nation with an established church, where the church itself is part of the body politic itself, part of the clash that's happening right now is that that's being questioned. If you go to churches, you'll see mostly, the majority of the congregation are older people. It doesn't mean that people don't live according to certain precepts, but they don't live as, say, the way my parents lived or the way my mother lives. It's a different idea about our spiritual life, if we have one.
Does it matter that now a quarter of people say they're not involved with any religion at all? Do you think that's a good thing?
I do think it's a good thing, yes, and it's the interesting figure in a way. It's gone right up to just over 25% of the population, so 1 in every 4 people you meet is going to be a person who isn't looking at the world through a particular pair of spectacles. It's a much more interesting figure in a way than the just under 60% who now say that they're Christian, the majority of whom probably have ticked that box for cultural identity reasons rather than any great commitment to doctrinal matters. But they don't do it now,
so does that mean an even greater distance from being an ethnic or cultural Christian or whatever you want to call it?
Yes, but I think it means that there is a greater openness and acceptance of the fact that there are other ways of thinking about the world, that you don't identify, for example, your local bishop as the moral authority in your community. It means that people have taken on board the idea of increased individual responsibility for thinking about how they get on with others.
Does it make you act any differently?
Yes, I think it does.
Think
it does.
Yes, I think
it does.
Because if you're thinking about your relationships with others in your community, and there are 2 things here. Firstly, the recognition of the fact that it's your responsibility to think about those things, and secondly, that there's more demand on you to think about the diversity of the people around you. Both of them are very, very positive. The people who rise to the challenge are going to be better citizens as a result.
Do you buy that?
Not wholly. I mean, among other reasons why this upsurge of people declaring themselves to be, atheists or agnostics is obviously that there's a greater visibility in society now of people who promote an atheist worldview and had great success and great publicity for that. And so more people have become comfortable about saying they don't believe, where a generation ago, certainly, a lot of those people would have remained quiet about that. But as for the impact, one thing that makes me nervous about, as it were, celebrating this, which comes back to this thing of cultural identity. If as a country we're going to have any coherence in the years ahead, it seems to me that we need a kind of core identity. Now, we might disagree what the nature of that is. It was, and maybe still is, that we're centred on a Christian, Judeo-Christian worldview, even if you don't believe. But that is an identity. The question I would have then is, if these 25% of people who say that they are atheists or non-believers, in this huge smorgasbord of identities that we'll have in Britain, what are those people?
Well,
they can't just not be believers.
But you see, there's always this fail-safe, spoken or unspoken, that there is a British identity. That's always interesting to me. I think one of the geniuses of the British, of being British, is that there isn't this sort of rock-solid definition of identity that an American has, which is built by the first and second.
But there was an identity.
Well, there is an identity, but it's not the kind of identity I've experienced. It's not the kind of identity a French person would experience. So the brilliance of this nation is that actually people who come in are absorbed in this thing called the British identity. Sometimes it takes a long time, sometimes it's violent, it'll take centuries, but it has.
Well, you see, the good thing that is happening is that we're forging a new kind of identity, and it's an identity of inclusion and acceptance of pluralism. It doesn't mean that you have to have so much conformity and so much convention. And this greater plurality of opportunities that people have to be human in their own way is a very welcome thing.
I absolutely agree with that. But the reason why this plurality in things is possible is in part because of our history, in part because of having an accepting culture. What happens when when everyone can pursue whatever they want, except that the main core of that culture disappears.
Well, we'll find out in 10 years' time if there's another census. Let's leave it there. Let's move on. Because for months we've been told that Syria isn't Libya, not a country where Western powers should even think of intervening in an internal conflict which was sparked by the Arab Spring. But in the past week or so, NATO countries have become increasingly worried about the chemical weapon stocks possessed by the Assad regime, and at least two nightmarish possibilities. One, Assad's forces might use them against the rebels in Syria, and two, the rebel forces, including those associated with Hezbollah or Al-Qaeda, might get their hands on nerve gas and other toxins. Well, our diplomatic editor Mark Urban is here to talk through what's happening on the ground and the way it's seen by NATO. Mark.
Well, the subject of escalation has been high on everyone's agenda.